Hello, welcome. Got Alex Krainer with me today. So welcome, Alex.
Pleasure to join you, Finian.
Mm. Alex Krainer is the author of this book entitled Grand Deception, a study on the character known as Bill Browder, who the American government have relied on to implement various onerous sanctions on Russia. It's quite an intriguing case study of Mr. Browder and his allegations about the Russian government. But that's for another day. We Alex has promised me just before we went live that he will do a second interview, and we'll talk about that book and Bill Browder and various other dimensions of that story. But today's discussion is on the NATO bombing of former Yugoslavia. This month, in fact, marks the 25th anniversary since that NATO campaign. Just to refresh everybody's memory on the history, on the 24th of March, NATO launched a bombing campaign of former Yugoslavia. It continued for approximately 10 weeks from March until June of 1995. No, sorry, 1999, sorry, 25 years ago. Now, there's huge significance to that campaign, which Alex Krainer will help us delve into. So, Alex, let's just talk about it. If you want to go back on the history of that bombing campaign, please do.
Well, I have to confess that at the time, I wasn't very well aware of the significance of the events. That was 1999. Croatia ended its war with former Yugoslavia or Serbia at the end of 1995 and beginning of 1996. And so we were a post force at the time. The president of Serbia was Slobodan Milosevic, who was, from our perspective, he was the enemy, and he was the enemy. I'll get into the character of Slobodan Milosevic a little bit later, but basically the significance of the event is that, to my mind, this was the first time that NATO showed itself for what it is, that it has crossed the line into illegality, that it has broken the international law, and that it has bombed a sovereign country in Europe. I think overtly it was, as always, human rights, taking down a villainous dictator in Serbia, affecting regime change. But in reality, that broke Serbia's opposition to the NATO, and it enabled the United States to carve away Kosovo, which was a semi-autonomous province within Serbia, and to create it into their own little vassal state, where they have the largest military base in Southern Europe, and which they have used to train whole brigades of jihadis who later fought in places like Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East.
Wow,
So
that's really important, Alex. So
yes,
Kosovo, the state that came out of former Yugoslavia, as you say, from the carve up of that country by the NATO intervention, then produced Kosovo, which is lends itself to being a proving ground or a military staging ground for American mercenaries and proxies for other countries to propagate the American policy of intervention or regime change.
yes, correct. And so Kosovo is being run up to this day as basically as an American fiefdom. I don't know if the fiefdom of the Pentagon or of the CIA, but it's probably a little bit of both. And they use it for affecting their foreign policy objectives in this region.
Mm.
And the carve out of Kosovo away from Serbia was illegal, and it's almost exactly what we see in Ukraine today, with an important difference that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is not necessarily illegal. Actually, there are very, very strong grounds in international law where pretty much everything that Russia has done in Ukraine could be legally defended, which is not the case for American actions in Serbia and in Kosovo.
Mm.
And so this was a signal to the international community, to those who paid attention, that we're dealing with a rogue military structure, being, the United States and the NATO, and that the NATO is not necessarily just a defensive alliance, as it has always maintained, but it's actually an aggressive tool of foreign policy
Mm.
of the Western, foreign policy establishment. And that principle was confirmed a few years later when they did the same in Libya and
Mm.
Syria. And so Serbia was the first case where NATO had shown its true colors as a rogue military organization, or at least rogue in the sense of international law.
Yeah. I mean, we have to remember, Alex, that this military campaign in 1999 was only 8 years after the so-called end of the Cold War.
Yes.
The Soviet Union and the United States, officially drew a close to the Cold War in 1991. And 8 years later, then NATO is bombing a former Warsaw Pact country. It's quite amazing, really, the rapid intervention of NATO, the military deployment within a short time of the Cold War supposedly ending, and all the promises that were made between Washington to Moscow. And yet we have NATO launching this quite audacious military operation in former Yugoslavia. And as you said, Alex, or as you alluded to, there was no international mandate or legal mandate for this intervention. I mean, the United Nations Security Council did not give a mandate to empower this intervention. Russia and China, I believe, vetoed such a mandate at the UN Security Council. So the US-led NATO alliance proceeded unilaterally on its own steam to militarily intervene in Europe. As you said, illegally, effectively, that was illegal. There was no international legal basis to their intervention.
Yes, exactly. It was illegal. It was the case of might makes right. And so the United States and NATO had their policy objectives, and they have achieved. They simply decided to get them done by force, and that's what they did. And I think that, back in 1999, we had Bill Clinton in power. He was a little bit of a political rock star. Russia was on her knees. Slobodan Milosevic was rightly maligned in Western press. He was a thuggish personality, and he was equally the tool of the Western financial oligarchy. I'll explain that. So he, in a way, he brought it on himself in a similar way as Saddam Hussein did before him. First, he made himself the servant of the Western interests in the region, and then when he wouldn't go along with their agenda at a later date, then they eliminated him and they destroyed his country. Same story as with Saddam Hussein and many other servants of the Western powers. That very often happened. So Slobodan Milosevic came to power in former Yugoslavia after he spent 4 years in New York working there as a banker. So I believe that during those 4 years, he was kind of prepared for his mission to break up former Yugoslavia in a similar way as Leon Trotsky was prepared in New York for his mission to destroy Russia, the Russian Tsarist regime. And then when he came back to Yugoslavia, he became the president of the socialist of the Communist Party of Serbia, and he started really wrecking the nation of former Yugoslavia, and he kind of pushed other republics like Slovenia, Croatia, to a lesser extent Bosnia and Macedonia, to seek autonomy. So at the beginning, in the late 1980s and early in 1990, what Slovenia and Croatia were demanding was a confederation where we would maintain a financial and security union of the former Yugoslavian republics, but we sought greater autonomy in managing our own political and economic affairs, because what was happening is that the Belgrade was kind of collecting most of the tax receipts collected all around former Yugoslavia, and then they had kind of a hegemonic position in deciding how this money would be allocated. And so, north and west of the country were feeling that they were getting shortchanged, and they wanted to change this. But Milosevic kind of created a very, very rigid set of barriers to these reforms, and he gave the other republics no choice but to eventually seek independence. So the talk about confederacy, the talk about greater autonomy and independence for the republics, it all failed, and it was made to fail deliberately by whoever was giving Milosevic his marching order, and I believe that these were Western financial interests. And then, we were plunged into a war. And not only, after Croatia declared independence, then we had these extremist elements who came to Croatia from various places like Canada, Western Europe, and these were kind of, I wouldn't say exactly like Azov battalion in Ukraine, but they were these types of extremists. Mm-hmm. And they made sure that peace wouldn't break out and that to give war a chance. And then the whole country kind of went into a phase of bloody disintegration. But Slobodan Milosevic was definitely the man who put the wedge into the political system of former Yugoslavia and set the stage for its disintegration.
And Alex, what do you think Washington or the NATO leadership, what do you think their objective was in shattering, balkanizing Yugoslavia, that part of Europe? What do you think, was there a bigger geopolitical target to increase their hegemonic control over Europe vis-a-vis Russia? What do you think the American objective was in targeting Yugoslavia in the way that they did?
Okay, so I'm not 100% sure, because I've read a number of different studies and documents about this. The Balkans are always one of the flashpoints that can precipitate a regional or continent-wide crisis. Let's not forget the tensions between Serbia and the Bosnian side of the former Austria-Hungarian Empire were used by the British Foreign Service and their intelligence services to precipitate World War I. It wasn't over the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand that was, let's say, the cause célèbre, like George Floyd killing or something like this, But the crisis between the Serbs and Austria-Hungary was deliberately orchestrated by the British diplomacy and secret services to draw Russia and Germany into World War I. And so I think that as such, it was maybe in the interest of the Western powers to destabilize the Balkans. Obviously, it creates problems for Russia. It creates problems for the rest of Europe. It creates problems on the relations between Serbs and Albanians, Serbs and Muslims in Bosnia. And so, it could be useful that way, particularly for people who like to foment wars all around the world to achieve their geopolitical objectives. Yugoslavia was a fairly prosperous country. It had low debt. It had a certain important degree of independence and non-alignment with respect to Western powers and with respect to the communist bloc as well. And it was a good place. But, it had its own independent policy. It had its own independent economic policy as well. And so I think that one of the ways in which foreign financial interests were able to take advantage of the fall of Yugoslavia is to settle our republics with local oligarchies that are loyal to Brussels, to London, to Washington, and to load up these wealthy nations with debt. And to literally run the balance sheet of what's good to own here and take it over, and that's what they did.
Yeah, and as you say, to make trouble for Russia in its backyard. I mean, at that time in 1999, Boris Yeltsin was the Russian president, and very much Russia was like almost a vassal state of the United States, and actually that gets back to that gets back to your book about Bill Browder. That period, that 1990s, the roaring 1990s, when the American capitalist investors really had Russia on its knees. But I'm just going to move on, Alex, to another point that I'm going to make, that in 1999, apart from the unprecedented bombing campaign of former Yugoslavia by NATO, I mean, that year saw the first expansion of NATO after the Cold War. We had in that year Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, I believe it was Hungary, joined the NATO alliance. So 8 years after the so-called end of the Cold War, and all the promises that were made of détente and cooperation from Washington to Moscow, not only had we the bombing of a former Warsaw Pact country, the former Yugoslavia, but we also then had the expansion of NATO with 3 very important European countries. Again, in complete contradiction to what was promised to the Russian leadership or the Soviet leadership at the time of the end of the Cold War. So I think it seems to me, in hindsight, very significant that we had those 2 events. The expansion, the first round of expansion, and there's been 5, I believe, since the end of the Cold War. But that was the first one in 1999, and then the bombing of former Yugoslavia. So setting up a precedent that this rogue military alliance could really operate above the law and do whatever it wished to do militarily. So I think, would you agree, Alex, that was a significant development?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that has been the process which has led us to where we are today, because they took out an independent nation, sovereign nation, which was former Yugoslavia. They turned most of the republics in former Yugoslavia into their own vassals, which are subordinated. They destroyed Serbia and took down Slobodan Milosevic, who was maybe the last holdout. They created, a military encampment in in Kosovo, and then they kept adding more countries to the NATO military alliance. This is a very, very obvious pursuit of the strategy of Eurasian hegemony, because if we go back to the famous Halford Mackinder's heartland theory, this has been an obsession of the British Empire and its American reincarnation for 2 centuries. And basically it says that if you want to rule the world, you have to rule the world island, meaning the Eurasian landmass. If you want to rule the Eurasian landmass, you have to rule the heartland, which is kind of the area between the Caucasus and the European part of Russia. And if you want to rule the heartland, you have to rule Eastern Europe, which is, you have to have hegemony over the Eastern European nations, Central Europe, meaning Germany, Hungary, Austria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and then obviously the Balkans as well. So all of this has been a slow progression in the direction of cementing the Western powers' hegemony over the Eurasian landmass. And the only reason is, this is nothing to do with freedom, democracy, international law, human rights. It has to do with resources. It has to do with the fact that this is where 75% of the global GDP is, 2/3 of the world's energy resources, something like 2/3 or 70% of other mineral wealth of the world, and the bulk of the global population, which is what you need to be able to turn those resources into financial flows in your in your banking system. Resources are no good unless you can mobilize the labor power to extract them and to put them on global markets. And so this is exactly that game. The opening gambit perhaps was the bombing of former Yugoslavia, but everything that followed was part of the same game, including the current war in Ukraine.
Yeah, Alex, great insight there, that this continuum from 1999, 25 years up to the present war in Ukraine. Just getting back to this place, Kosovo, which in 2008 then declared itself as independent. The Western powers endorsed that, even though legally dubious, and whenever it's done elsewhere, like in Crimea, the Western powers would completely deny that as a legitimate call of independence in Crimea's case, whereas in Kosovo they wholeheartedly endorsed it. This place, Kosovo, Alex, you mentioned just earlier on that it's an important staging ground for military groups that the US uses. Does Kosovo supply foot soldiers for the war in Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine, according to your information?
I actually don't know about that. I think it's not very meaningful, but I know that many jihadis were sent to Syria from Kosovo. Yeah, so I'm not sure that they're active in Ukraine to any large extent, but I know that they were definitely very active with I don't know, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra fronts, the not so moderate rebels that were opposed to the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Yeah, so they're definitely they trained up a lot of jihadis there in their military base in Kosovo.
Yeah, I've seen reports of jihadis being deployed in Ukraine along with the Azov and the neo-Nazi battalions. I don't know how significant it is, but there's certainly reports of jihadi fighters deployed in Ukraine on behalf of the NATO military forces. But Alex, I think that's a really significant point that you make, that the bombing of Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, 25 years ago, was the opening gambit for a bigger geopolitical play to do with pursuing Washington's hegemonic ambitions that the European vassal states comply with, and that campaign, which lasted for 10 weeks, was quite a watershed event in terms of what followed. After that, we had Iraq, well, Afghanistan, Iraq, the whole so-called global war on terrorism, a carte blanche for the Americans to intervene whenever they deemed, that it was necessary. So that former Yugoslavia bombing campaign opened the door to or the gates of hell, if you like, to unbridled military aggression around the world, which has no legal basis. I mean, the so-called endless wars or endless wars of aggression.
Yes, and so correct. And this was a process of supplanting the order that existed during the Cold War, from the end of World War II until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there was a rethinking among the Western powers. George Soros famously wrote an article on his Open Society website somewhere. It's still there. It's called Towards the New World Disorder, maybe, or Order. I'm not sure which the title is, either Towards the New World Order or Towards the New World Disorder, in which he actually lays all this out, in which he's saying that, well, okay, we need to use NATO as an enforcement arm of the New World Order. We need to whittle away the sovereignty of independent nations, and we need to probably prepare to use NATO technology coupled with basically Eastern European cannon fodder. He wrote this article in 1993. It's really uncanny to what extent events have dovetailed with exactly what he was advocating in this article. So it tells you where the source of power is. It's with the Western financial oligarchy. The military are the execution arm. The United States and NATO. The politicians are the entertainment, the justification arm of everything, but the agenda itself has been formulated long ago by the financial oligarchy in the West.
Well said, Alex. Alex Krainer, we're going to leave it there. I think it was a very enlightening discussion. Thank you so much. I hope the listeners think so too. We're going to come back, Alex, I hope in the near future, to discuss your book, Grand Deception, about the rise of this guy, Bill Browder, and his hijinks in the Russia during the 1990s, and how that has, well, on the subject of oligarchy, financial oligarchic power, how it nearly got away with subjugating Russia. Perhaps when Putin came to power and kicked all these characters out, that's why he's incurred the wrath of the American oligarchy and European oligarchy. So we'll return to that, Alex, in the near future, hopefully. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Alex, for your great contribution today.
Great pleasure to join you, Finian, anytime.
Yes. Thanks, Alex. Cheerio.
Pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.